you have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
How much higher?
Probably somewhere between 8 and 10 times higher.
What's up guys, Derek, MorePlatesMoreDates.com. Today we're talking about Chris Hemsworth taking time off of acting after learning about his 10x plus risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. He had a hard conversation with Peter Attia, who went through his blood work A to Z and also did a genome analysis, presumably, where he discovered he is predisposed to Alzheimer's multiple fold times higher than the average human. And it actually does run in Chris's family. His grandfather, he's mentioned in this National Geographic show, Limitless with Chris Hemsworth, where they do this interview and stuff, that his grandfather doesn't really remember much, and it's a cause of the disease. It debilitates your memory, makes you forget mostly everything, even stuff that's important to you. And that's the wildly messed up thing about this disease too, is oftentimes you don't actually end up dying from the disease directly. Rather, it makes you essentially not even really know how to comprehend when something is wrong with you. So then you may not otherwise go seek help or know what to do when you have, an ailment or some sort of symptom or whatever. Like, you literally forget how to do basic stuff like take care of yourself. And it's very, very scary to think about this happening to your brain. The thought of not having control over something and being able to just like forget important people in your life, important events, it's terrifying stuff, as you would expect. So this hit pretty hard for Chris, and you can see his reaction when he gets the news broke to him from Peter.
You have 2 copies of ApoE4, a set from your mom and a set from your dad.
And what does that mean exactly?
That means you have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
How much higher?
Probably somewhere between 8 and 10 times higher than that of someone in the general population.
Like, for him, this hits harder too, because he knows it runs in his family. So it's not a coincidence that this is showing up on his test, despite the fact that there are individuals who could have this exact same genetic predisposition and not otherwise have Alzheimer's. Like, there's actual evidence of it running in his bloodline, essentially. So he goes on to say, what his response was to getting the news.
Won't be able to remember the life I've experienced, or my wife, my kids. This is probably my biggest fear.
The Alzheimer's Association cautions against genetic testing for most people because a positive test does not mean you will in fact develop Alzheimer's and can cause people to worry unnecessarily. But making healthy choices today can reduce risk later in life.
So that's the interesting thing about this, is there are certain individuals that want to know what happens to them, want to know ahead of time what the risk is for certain things so they can just be more prepared. You had Dana White going to that Gary Brecka guy and getting an analysis on exactly when he's going to die, supposedly, which obviously is a bit of a far-fetched thing to think was actually totally accurate to begin with. But if you get a reality check like that, a lot of people need that kick in the ass to actually get in gear and fix things in their life that may have otherwise led to this outcome. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that it can freak people out unnecessarily, potentially, but on the other side of the spectrum may make people who are actually genetically predisposed be way more cautious about how they're living their life, eating, behaving, the environment they're putting themselves in, etc., which indirectly, even if you weren't predisposed, is going to massively benefit your cardiovascular disease risk, your, everything under the sun. A lot of it is interconnected and will be impactful on many areas of your life and quality of life and overall broad spectrum health.
It's my belief that if we take every step possible, we can reduce your risk to that of anyone else.
So this was probably the heaviest hitting thing in the entire series, in my opinion. I watched the series recently. I thought it was really good. Not as much insight into, hormones as I was hoping to see, but that's just, my own unique interest. So, but other than that, there's a lot of cool stuff about stress resilience, motivation, lifestyle and behavior changes, sauna, heat shock proteins, like tons of stuff, breath work, cardiovascular disease risk. It was a pretty insightful series that was entertaining simultaneously, and I imagine will inspire change in a lot of people. And also probably inspire a lot of proactive health screening, which I think is important, despite the fact that some people might think, oh, you find out you have this, it's going to make you unnecessarily worried. It's like, well, is there a harm in that if you are going to be motivated to then improve your quality of life subsequent to that? I don't necessarily know that pro and con like seesaw is going to be a net negative where you overly start worrying about it, but you know that it could be so impactful on via the changes you make after that fact that you could attenuate your risk to that of, potentially a normally not genetically predisposed person. Or that person is probably more likely to get it if they are not taking care of themselves relative to somebody being super dialed in. Now, again, that is not always the case. There are certain individuals, like less than 1% of the time, I believe is the statistic, where Alzheimer's can be so heavily genetically driven through both genetic and epigenetic influences through, like behavior and environmental influences that cause, specific gene expression individually too, that, yeah, you could be one individual who may have the lowest risk of there's a very low probability that it's basically going to happen no matter what. And there are certain individuals who you see who get cancer even when they're like a child. And it's not like they've done anything necessarily different to influence that. They just got the short end of the stick when it comes to the genetic lottery, unfortunately. But the majority of the time, the majority of individuals, even those who have these specific genetic variants like the ApoE4, you could make a dramatic change in lifestyle, behavior, dietary changes, etc., sleep hygiene practices that could attenuate your risk to that of, like Peter said, it's essentially no different than the average individual ideally. So what exactly is Alzheimer's? I thought it was worthwhile to get into how to check your predisposition to the same thing that Chris has as well, because this is a very, very common assessment metric in your genome analysis through like a 23andMe or Ancestry or whatever. Like you can download your raw genome, or at least a limited, snippet of it. And this is a very, very prominently, like, I don't think there are any companies that exclude this from your analysis. I could be wrong on that, but getting your entire genome sequenced, I believe, is extremely cost prohibitive and likely not something that the majority of people are going to be able to do. But some of these like really impactful genotypes are things that can be assessed, like the ApoE4 alleles. So for a general understanding of what this is, like, I think it's key to note that this isn't a disease that just randomly one day your brain just ceases to function. Rather, it's a progressive thing whereby you have neuronal damage and you lose connections to each other and they slowly die off over time. But this is something that can be attenuated through, like, again, it's mostly driven through genetic predisposition, aging, but then also behavior and lifestyle and environmental factors that will influence epigenetic expression and whatnot that can be influenced through individually manipulatable changes in your own life. So this is the most important thing to note, is you can attenuate your risk very significantly. And it's also important to note that just because you're the one who has, ApoE4, it doesn't mean that you're going to get it. There are certain individuals that are not ApoE4 and get it as well, and individuals who are ApoE4 who don't get it. One thing that is notable about it is essentially the combination of factors and what you can do personally to lessen your risk. And notable, it is more predominantly found in women. The reason being, I've mentioned many times on my channel before, when they hit menopause and hormones crash into nothingness, for men, they don't experience just a sharp decline, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone into the ground, whereby they're then functioning off of their adrenal steroids essentially. Whereas for women, that very much is the case. When you hit menopause, all of a sudden, these hormones that used to function and fluctuate in a specific rhythm based on your menstrual cycle and whatnot, these hormones are no longer functioning or being produced in sufficient quantities to actually offset or attenuate neurotoxicity, cardiotoxicity, facilitates actually nutrient partitioning in a maximum capacity. Maintaining muscle mass is a lot more difficult, bone mineral density loss. There are so many things that factor into what happens to you in a postmenopausal state as a result of hormone deprivation that it is far more prevalent in women. Like, I think 2/3 of the cases or more of Alzheimer's disease are in women, and it is believed to be mainly driven through the crashing of endogenous hormones as a result of the going through menopause. And that's why for men, it is less prevalent because of this. And this is why I think HRT is something that should be more heavily considered in women perimenopause. And when they are implementing it, and what they are implementing should be obviously not just haphazardly decided on, you know, just randomly start taking testosterone, estrogen, progesterone because you think you're going through menopause. Like, this is something that should be evaluated through symptoms, blood test analysis with a professional, and then going accordingly based on where you're at, because you don't want to be proactively getting on hormones that are then going to suppress your endogenous hormones when you otherwise didn't need to yet, just because you're trying to be, you know, proactive about attenuating the risk of Alzheimer's or something like that. This is something that will have its time in place almost certainly, but it needs to be something you educate yourself about and work with a professional on if you're going to go about it. I'm not saying it is a mandatory thing by any means whatsoever, but there is certainly a very, very, very obvious tie-in between estrogen deprivation, progesterone, testosterone, and the subsequent neurotoxic neurodegeneration that occurs as a result of these hormones being plummeted into the ground. So it is absolutely worth evaluating. And even, you know, the modality of achieving physiological levels through exogenous HRT. This is something, again, you need to be working with somebody who's actually well-versed in this stuff, not just doing cookie cutter, you know, synthetic hormone replacement and putting you on like a fucking birth control pill. Like, you need bioidentical hormone replacement that is representative of what your endogenous levels ideally would have otherwise been as a healthy young woman, is what I think to be the proper way to at least go about it under adequate medical oversight with a professional, of course, and having somebody even versed on how to administer it, you know, oral versus transdermal, which one is going to lead to a disproportionate spike in estrone relative to the actual estradiol you're trying to get out of it. Like, these are things that need to be considered, and is why finding a professional who knows what they're doing is so key. And is why I'm so passionate about the services offered at Merrick Health. Talked about Merrick Health many times before. You can get elaborate blood work and diagnostic workups done, then get targeted recommendations based on your own individual needs here. And we have elaborate blood test panels with experts ready and providers to give targeted insight, recommendations, and overall medical oversight thereafter, if appropriate, for pharmacologic intervention or just basic lifestyle, dietary, sleep hygiene changes too, if those are what are warranted. Because again, it's not always drugs. You may not need HRT whatsoever. You may just need a professional to oversee basic stuff. So anyways, without getting too derailed, Alzheimer's disease seems to progress in one of a few ways. One of it may be vascular. So if you have an issue with actually getting oxygenated blood to tissues and delivering actual nutrients to your brain adequately, you are going to undergo neurodegeneration as you would expect. In addition, metabolic issues is like a constellation of factors, but is largely deriving from, and when I say it's constellation of factors, this is the kind of like metabolic syndrome you're probably familiar with if you follow the longevity and optimization space. There are a lot of factors that play into assessing, you know, metabolic like dysfunction essentially, but ultimately, you know, being an insulin resistant, fat, out of shape, not having any muscle, being a skinny fat individual who otherwise can't make good use of the nutrients that they are ingesting, you know, over consuming, individuals that have hypertension, dyslipidemia or dyslipidemia, I always fuck up that word, blood glucose and insulin dysregulation, abdominal obesity, like a lot of different risk factors that play into it that develop this kind of constellation of things that is representative of metabolic dysfunction. A lot of people have different, you know, terminology for it, but ultimately it's just not being a metabolically healthy individual. And then there's also the buildup of toxins in the brain, like beta amyloid plaque and tau. And these are things that are going to be dealt with high quality lifestyle, sleep especially, diet with micro and macronutrient density, not just macro, and other things, which we'll get into shortly. But ultimately, the low-hanging fruit that very much addresses optimization of your life in all ways very much still applies to attenuating Alzheimer's disease. And one thing I did want to run through with you guys is showing you how to assess if you have the same genetic predisposition as Chris. So if you go to get a 23andMe test done, you spit in a tube and check, you know, your ancestry or whatever, you can get your raw data and assess certain health predispositions as well. And again, this isn't representative of you're definitely going to get this if you have this genotype, but it is something that could otherwise put it on your radar and maybe make you take it a bit more seriously sooner, which it very much seems to have for Chris. So we'll get into that in a second. I just want to see if he had anything notable to add before we get into it.
Hemsworth kickstarted those steps with a multi-day trek. Studies show diet and exercise, strong social connections, and new intellectual challenges can reduce Alzheimer's risk. With a friend in tow, but no maps and no phones.
Children, you know, forgets. And Yes, it's heartbreaking.
And Chris Hemsworth joins us now. Thank you for coming in. So were you apprehensive at all about taking that test?
To be honest, I didn't know what the test was at the time. The idea was they were going to do a deep dive into my blood work, look at my genetics, and on camera tell me what they found, and didn't expect to find.
So that was really the first time you found out?
It's the first time I found out off camera, because the doctor, Peter Attia, said this is not something I want to give him the opportunity to, maybe he does or doesn't want to talk about it. And look, it's not a predeterministic gene, it was just an indicator that says I'm in a high risk category, but it very quickly just became another wonderful motivation to make some changes and arm myself with all the tools to live a healthier, better life.
Yeah, so for me, I feel that is the best way to perceive this kind of news. Like, I don't see it as a negative thing to find out, what you're genetically predisposed to. I think it would otherwise give you the motivation or like reality check and kick in the ass to then get in gear and make the necessary recommendations to your lifestyle accordingly. I mean, I don't think just blindly going through your life hoping you're a fucking genetic phenom is the answer, because oftentimes you'll have a rude awakening when all of a sudden you have a jammer, or you end up with, cognitive impairment that has been accumulating for years, and you could have otherwise offset it earlier if you had the foresight and the willingness to go get assessed adequately and actually get a workup done to see where you're at with your, atherogenic particle breakdown, to assess what your atherosclerosis potential might be, or if you have a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, certain things that can otherwise be predictive of what may happen down the road, but won't necessarily happen if you fix your shit right now. Hopefully, that's the idea. So again, give yourself the best chance to thrive. A long, healthy, vitality rich life is the ideal scenario. So these are the markers you want to be looking at in your whatever program it is you're using or company that you're using. This is 23andMe. So spit in the tube test gives you your ancestry, but it also gives you certain genetic predispositions, and both positive and negative. You can find some longevity genes in here too that might otherwise be protective. But anyways, RS429358. So here, my genotype is TT at the ApoE gene. So if you cross-reference that with SNPedia, which gives you the references for what these mean, a lot of the times, most of these you can find in here. This SNP located in the 4th exon of the ApoE gene affects the amino acid at position 130 of the resulting protein. The more common RS429358 allele is T. If the allele is C and the same chromosome also harbors the RS7412 allele, C allele, the combination is known as an ApoE4 allele. The ApoE4 allele has a strong influence on the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So for me to get that assessment of, okay, RS7412, want to check that first. So you would plug it into the raw data search bar if you're on 23andMe or wherever you're looking. Check the marker RS7412. You see the genotype CC. So for me, when you're assessing the common name, is what it's called for me, you would have the breakdown of RS429358. For me, it was TT. And for RS7412, I had CC. So this is my variant, the most common. So ApoE3E3. Now you can see here, ApoE4E4, roughly 11 times increased Alzheimer's risk. And if you go back to this section that we were looking at a second ago, many studies have estimated the level of risk, and it varies depending on age, sex, ethnicity, and other factors. And one meta-analysis estimated the odds ratio for homozygous RS429358 individuals compared to the more common ApoE3 homozygotes to be 12 times for the late onset Alzheimer's and 61 times for early onset disease. Meta-analyses have also supported the association between the ApoE4 allele and somewhat increased risk for heart disease with an odds ratio of 1.42. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean, and this is, a spectrum too. So one of the two SNPs relevant to classifying ApoE genotype, 3 times roughly increased risk for Alzheimer's, 1.4 times increased risk for heart disease. And this is the one that I have common. And then I had CC of the other one. So again, this is just like a breakdown that assesses your predisposition likelihood, but can be altered significantly through different behaviors and environmental influences, like I mentioned earlier, and shouldn't ultimately dictate like, oh, I'm fucked or I'm not fucked. You should rather be altering lifestyle accordingly regardless, but this is going to be a heavy motivator for certain people like Chris, who's going to take it way more seriously now that he knows. Like, he knows it's not just random by chance that his grandfather experienced this. Like, it very much runs in his genetics, and it will likely be something that he passes on in some capacity to his children, and things that they should be mindful of, and he can pass on those good habits to them as well. And there are other genetic predispositions that are worthwhile to dig into this data for as well, like MTHFR. If you're homozygous C677T, I believe it is, for MTHFR, your ability to methylate is impaired so significantly that you probably have a higher likelihood of having just like a pretty fucking elevated homocysteine level, which is going to be problematic for Alzheimer's disease risk as well, and elevate the probability and severity of it and acceleration of it significantly. Like, there's a lot of overlap with this too. And this is also for people literally with the most ideal variant. Individuals that have the worst methylation impairments are going to have other problems that relate to cardiovascular disease, cognitive health. And it's not necessarily just if you don't have this that Chris has, then you're good. It is one of the most aggressive predictors, I suppose, from the genetic analysis, and is worth looking at for sure, but it's not the end all be all. You could have, like, for example, what I showed for myself and still get it if you have a terrible lifestyle. Now, some of the most impactful low-hanging fruit lifestyle things that I would be doing personally are maintaining a high quality circadian rhythm and actually following it when you are going to sleep, going to bed at the same time every night, getting up as the sun is rising, getting sun in your eyes when you wake up, avoiding blue light before you go to sleep. You know, some of this stuff, it's like, again, I don't know how impactful it'll be on your quality of sleep, but this is where you could use like a sleep tracking device, like an Oura Ring or a Whoop or whatever, to assess your, deep sleep, REM sleep metrics, but also just like, how do you feel? Do you have blood pressure dysregulation or any sort of signs and symptoms of poor quality sleep as well? Or just like general cardiovascular issues too. Like, you should be keeping tabs on biofeedback on a regular basis to assess, like, what's your resting pulse? Is your heart working way harder than it should be just to fucking sit there and oxygenate tissues? What is your blood pressure? How high quality of your sleep? How high quality is your sleep? Do you feel rested when you get up in the morning? If you want to check that through devices, you can. If you have sleep apnea, that should absolutely be addressed. If you don't know if you have sleep apnea and you sleep 8 hours a night, but you feel that you never get high quality restful sleep, maybe you should be getting a sleep study done. Reducing stress, obviously easier said than done, but something that should be absolutely at least kept an eye on and tried to be adhered to. Stress is a big longevity killer for sure. Sauna, very, very impactful in cardiovascular disease risk, cognitive health, etc. Muscle-focused exercise, I think, is very important to stay insulin sensitive, not just going for long fucking marathon jogs, but rather, because some people might think like the most fit individuals are those who are just able to run long distances or whatever. And it's like, yeah, cardio can be useful, but again, like, there is some level of extreme cardiovascular training that is actually problematic. Most people aren't going to get there even if they fucking tried, to be honest. But I mean, muscle focused exercise, I think, is very important so you can actually be as insulin sensitive as possible, because again, metabolic syndrome and the constellation of insulin resistance type metrics are going to be impactful on brain health, cardiovascular disease, cancer cell proliferation and acceleration of its development, etc. And being mindful of just maintaining a high quality body composition and as strong of bones as you can as you age. Like, muscle focused exercise, I think, is something that should be highlighted, which often isn't. It's rather just like exercise, not muscle focused exercise. But in addition, getting your 10,000 steps per day or the equivalent of that, I would definitely recommend. That takes care of your low intensity, steady state work or something equivalent to that. And again, I'm not saying that's the optimal way to do it. It's just the most sustainable, I think, for most people that can be implemented into your daily life. Like, I like to go for 10-minute walks after each meal to actually partition nutrients more effectively and whatnot. Macro and micronutrients, not just macros. A lot of people just focus on, if they're even thinking about it, the amount of calories they're eating. Most people are over consuming food, which is problematic. Most of you guys on this channel probably are very, very hyper aware though of your calorie intake, your protein intake. Most people know how important it is to try and shoot for like a gram of protein per pound of body weight per day or something around there. But also micronutrient intake goes heavily overlooked. Like, for example, supporting cognitive health, choline intake. Like, are you getting enough of that? Do you have bioavailable B vitamins to support methylation and whatnot? Like, there are certain things that often go overlooked because people are more so looking at their carb intake, their fat intake, their protein intake, but skipping over the actual quality of the food. Cognitively demanding tasks and actually challenging your brain, something that could be very impactful too on maintaining sharpness, mental acuity as you age. And there are other things you can do do that are more nuanced and specific. Like for example, Rhonda Patrick has been on Rogan multiple times and is seen as a longevity expert, and she has published certain papers on ApoE4 specifically. And I believe she has the same predisposition that Chris has. So she's done multiple videos before and published papers, made content surrounding Alzheimer's disease specifically, because she has a lot of incentive to learn the most she can about it, because she is just as genetically predisposed as Chris is, or anybody else who has like the worst variant discovering this genetic predisposition. Like this is her talking to Peter Attia in a podcast a while ago, and you can tell like just how passionate she is about this topic and why.
Huge component for lifestyle in risk for Alzheimer's disease, particularly with having an ApoE4 allele. And that's where I've become obsessed. You know, I see, you know, I've been looking at mechanism, but also looking at, you know, the epi studies, looking at epidemiology. You see certain lifestyle factors, you know, for example, drinking. If you're drinking in your ApoE4, because you're inducing damage that you can't repair as well, you're going to fare worse, you know? So anything that's going to damage your body worse.
There is a lot of stuff that comes down to inflammation. Like I mentioned, some of the biomarkers, oxidative stress, and stuff that you just know is bad for you, like drinking heavily and fucking up your sleep, as well as the damage it does directly. Like there are a lot of things that basically it boils down to just like living a high quality life and doing the basics that most people are overlooking, but are very, very important. She's mentioned certain more specific things that can be done though too. Like for example, supplementing with phospholipid DHA is something that might be worthwhile, or just eating more fish, you know, to support cognitive health, because there may be particular nuance when it comes to DHA brain transport in those who have the ApoE4. So again, like she is a good page to follow in my opinion for educating yourself about the new findings surrounding Alzheimer's disease predisposition, because she is, like I said, heavily motivated to stay not only on top of it, but literally be publishing high quality literature about it as new developments unfold. She is seen as somewhat of an authority in the space, presumably. A lot of people defer to her for high quality information in this regard. So definitely a good follow, as well as Peter Attia. Obviously he knows fucking everything essentially when it comes to longevity and living a high quality, high vitality life. Because again, it's not just about living until you're like 100 plus, but being like frail and like falling apart and having a low quality of life. It's also the balance of longevity and vitality simultaneously. And he plays a good middle ground, in my opinion, in imparting high quality information that achieves that very outcome. So anyways, pretty cool series with Hemsworth, and hopefully he comes to the forefront with some more education around this and like what he's been doing, and it'll probably be motivational for a lot of people to not only take a proactive approach to assessing and screening their health metrics, but also make very, very informed, targeted protocol implementations for their own personal life when it comes to lifestyle changes, behavior modification, sleep hygiene, improvements, etc. And yeah. So anyways, be careful out there, do the basics. You know, the low-hanging fruit is often going to be the thing that ultimately is going to be the most impactful and get you the biggest bang for your buck, as you would have predicted likely. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. All the comments help the algorithm, and I much appreciate it. Like, subscribe, check out my blog, MorePlatesMoreDates.com. Follow me on Instagram at MorePlatesMoreDates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below, including Merrick Health, my preventative medicine hormone replacement therapy platform. Get connected with high quality medical providers who understand this stuff in thorough detail as well, are credentialed and can otherwise provide targeted recommendations based on these exact biomarkers and genetic predispositions to then improve your quality of life, your health, your vitality, and correct any deficiencies, imbalances that may be noted, and ideally just optimize your health from and quality of life from all aspects. We have elaborate diagnostic packages available with subsequent targeted recommendations based on those, and high quality reports with interventions that are not just pharmacologic, but also involve lifestyle, dietary changes, etc. And very much consider genetic predispositions like the one that Chris has himself. So if you want to check that out and get a high quality medical provider in your camp, that is something I cannot overstate the importance of enough. And anything else I'm associated with, it's all in the video description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.